So strap in, get in, and get funky as Hot News 64 takes you deep inside the splattered baddest bugs in the universe, science fiction action game of the century. You guys want to see this? Well, here it is. The bugs are coming, and it's not in peace. Jet Force Gemini.
Jet Force Gemini, developed by Rareware and released for the Nintendo 64 in 1999, demonstrates an amazing foundation for a third-person shooter style that 20 years later still hasn't been explored fully. Third-person shooters typically revolve around one of two systems, cover or platforming. Most of those that emphasize combat are cover-based, where progression through levels is relatively slow-paced and relies on avoiding enemy fire, such as titles like Gears of War. The others emphasize platforming and frequently involve the player clearing out waves of enemies at the same time, Dynasty Warrior style, such as Ratchet and Clank. There are very few games that accomplish what makes Jet Force Gemini, or JFG, a fun experience in this genre. What makes JFG a success, in my opinion, is that it emphasizes combat that focuses on shooting individual enemies like in a cover-based shooter, while also being free-roaming. The player can move through the level however they wish, targeting enemies as they choose instead of transitioning from point to point. The allure of Jet Force Gemini is that the enemy strength and numbers are balanced well enough with the capabilities of the player and character to where the player feels like a swift exterminator who is significantly more powerful than the enemies while still providing enough of a challenge for all types of players. Also, the game balances segments where the enemies are much stronger and more dangerous with segments that don't involve much combat to provide a good variety of gameplay. Since the player is given the freedom to navigate levels and zones however they choose, there are two memorable qualities of Jet Force Gemini that I have identified and have frequently been mentioned by other fans of the game. First, players who enjoyed JFG loved the sense of progression toward a meaningful and satisfying end. The player knows the ultimate goal from almost the start of the game, and the bulk of the first half is spent with each character progressing linearly to their individual boss before uniting against the first encounter with the main villain, Mizar. The experience of navigating around each level and finding the ship to travel to the next is something that I still remember enjoying as a kid. Also, the bosses of these sections are extremely memorable. They're challenging and formidable enough to be worth the effort in reaching them. The first half of the game makes the player feel like they're accomplishing something throughout its entirety as the characters progress toward Mizar's lair. The second beloved quality is how well the game encourages exploration. There's no objective destination marker for the player to follow telling them how to accomplish a task, so the player is compelled to see what's down every hallway and around each corner, instead of being told, go here and do this. This exploratory gameplay is complemented by the material rewards riddled throughout each level. Finding a hidden passageway or an inconspicuous path may lead to health and ammunition upgrades, new weapons, minigames, Easter eggs, multiplayer unlocks, and other payoffs that incentivize the player to stop and look around. There's a ton of rich, detailed, and creative content that isn't found on the main path in almost every level. The level design works with this as well. Required items are hidden in easy-to-find places toward the start of the game and become incrementally more difficult to find once the player knows that they should be looking for them and the ways in which they are hidden. When both of these qualities work together, Jet Force Gemini and others like it are some of my favorite games to play. An example of this is with the boss battles. One boss in particular, the Mechanids, two praying mantis creatures, is often mentioned when people reflect on playing this game. It comes at the end of what's usually the final segment of the first half of the game, so the player should already be familiar with needing to seek out upgrades for their weapons and health. Because of this, Lupus, the character used for this segment, isn't given many upgrades for free or in easy-to-find places. A player who rushes through his levels to the boss will be severely outgunned and underprepared, while a player who fully explores each area will have a much easier time. The difficulty of the game increases through gameplay and level design more than the strength and number of enemies, which is excellent game design. However, these qualities have to work together for a game like Jet Force Gemini to succeed and be enjoyable. When one of these isn't present, the appeal of the other quality disappears, and it actually becomes a detriment. You may have noticed I frequently addressed examples from the first half of JFG. If you talk to people who remember playing the game, very few will tell you that they actually saw the final boss. In spite of this, they still claim to have loved the game. It seems odd that so many people enjoyed playing Jet Force Gemini, but never finished it. But the reason is always the same. It wasn't because the game became too challenging or wasn't fun. It's a result of those previously mentioned qualities not working in tandem as the game advances towards its conclusion. About halfway through the game's primary content, the main objective for the player dramatically shifts. The villain has escaped and must be reached using a spaceship with missing parts. The player is tasked with finding these parts scattered across the levels while also collecting around 300 NPCs called tribals to reach the final level. The linear focused progression is replaced by revisiting previous levels with different characters to access new areas and hidden objects. The complete freedom to explore the game's worlds and finally check out areas that require different characters or items is fun for a while, but most players give up trying to find every spaceship part in Tribal. The excitement from the game wanes once the enjoyment from sandbox gameplay dies down. As a kid, I put dozens of hours into this game and even owned the player's guide, and I didn't complete it for over 10 years for this reason. This is the primary cause for why Jet Force Gemini isn't as revered as its peers like Banjo Kazooie. Accumulating collectibles isn't used to help the player succeed like it was in the first half of the game. It's not a reward for finishing a challenge or completing a portion of the game. It is the challenge, and it is the game. Items are strewn about in various places, and the game design boils down to finding them and nothing else. It's an Easter egg hunt where the prize only comes once every egg is found after hours of searching, and the appeal of that prize doesn't keep players invested long enough to reach it. Rare seemed to have been moving in this direction as the Nintendo 64 lifespan came to a close, with the pinnacle being Donkey Kong 64. However, the writing on the wall and the observable pitfalls of the collectathon design were already apparent by Jet Force Gemini. There's nothing to incentivize players to find everything required to beat this game. In fact, the game proper ends when this second segment of the game starts. Many adventure games allow the player to continue playing, revisiting old areas once the game is beaten, and that's how this feels in JFG. Like you've already beaten the game, but discovered that there's a hidden boss for people dedicated enough to collect everything the game has to offer. The only difference is that it's presented as main content that's required to see the credits. There's no sense of progression throughout this either. There's no build-up leading to finding a spaceship part or saving a group of tribals, and there's no tangible reward for any of these once they're finished. Collecting a part plays a sound effect and shows a text box, and it could go unnoticed entirely if you're not paying attention. Compare this to finding a star in Super Mario 64 or a Jiggy in Banjo Kazooie. Everything stops to celebrate what you accomplished so that you know the item is important. Also, the level design doesn't cater to finding the parts well. Despite several of them being located at the end of previously inaccessible areas, only 2 have specific objectives tied to them. One is the reward for winning a pod race, and the prize isn't even mentioned beforehand, and the other is from shooting gems into a spinning bin. For the rest, the gameplay and design are pure sandbox. The player chooses a character and level and explores whatever parts of it they wish, without any knowledge of whether or not they will find something there. This leads to tedious but mandatory searching through levels. Before, the player may check out an area that's out of the way in hopes of finding something to help them complete an objective, but now, it is the objective. There's a lot of fun things to find hidden about each of these levels, but the motivation to go looking steadily declines. Being required to collect all of the tribals is a readily identified problem in Jet Force Gemini. Even the developers have pointed out that it was excessive. However, the actual error in game design isn't as frequently discussed. Sure, finding about 300 tribals is a pain, but there are games designed around collecting similar things, and they succeed all the time. The real problem is that Jet Force Gemini's gameplay revolves solely around this task without any added content or direction. While the design is what hinders players' enjoyment of Jet Force Gemini, there are also several other issues that affect the game's reception. These are sometimes more apparent, but usually don't interfere so much with playability to discourage people from picking up the game entirely. As such, I've presented them here as a list instead of at length. The controls. Jet Force Gemini arrived on a console with one analog stick and before camera controls were very well developed. Playing the game now shows how its aiming and camera have aged, and it is fairly poor, but any game today should be able to address these effectively. The platforming. Several areas in the game involve platforming segments, requiring players to navigate different pieces of terrain and obstacles. The level design and controls don't support this very well, and these segments are usually more frustrating than fun. The dog character, Lupus, with his jet-boosted jumps, helps with a lot of these, and it's possible that the design choice to have him hover was based on the need for more accessibility and ease of movement in platforming. But, even with this in mind, the platforming just seems to get in the way of the core gameplay. Boss encounters and variety. Some of the few bosses in Jet Force Gemini are truly memorable, while others aren't. The first encounter with Mizar, the main antagonist, is preceded by a 6-minute cutscene, but the fight can be completed in under 10 seconds. Also, some of the bosses don't fit their environments as well as they could have, or have any interesting mechanics to them. The fights boil down to simply dodging projectiles or jumping over obstacles. There are several areas in the game that could have thematically appropriate bosses tied to them. I've always seen the abandoned space station as a beehive-looking structure that could have a massive queen bee lurking in or around it, waiting to ambush the player. Tribal fragility. Having to rescue 300 NPCs is an absolute chore, and what makes this especially frustrating is that they can be killed easily from bad enemy aim or by deliberately putting themselves in harm's way. When a tribal dies, the level must be restarted. Collecting them isn't cumulative, so if you don't get all of them in a level in one go, you may as well have just killed them all. Ease of access. To visit a part of a level, players have to arrive at the start of a planet and navigate to where they want to be. It makes sense to not let a player warp to the end of a previously completed zone, but many planets have multiple areas that are isolated, and being able to fast travel to the start of these upon finding them just makes sense. I also have several minor nitpicks from playing the game as excessively as I have. These are things that could probably have been corrected with more development time and playtesting, or they may just come down to taste. First off, there are a lot of fun weapons in the game that do interesting things, but only 2 weapons matter: the machine gun and the tri-rocket launcher. All of the other weapons, even the ones that are intended to be useful or seem powerful in how they're described, are useless in comparison. The plasma shotgun is exceptionally bad about this. Another thing is that many rooms require the player to kill all or a selected group of the enemies to unlock the door to progress. Occasionally, enemies will writhe on the ground for a long time without being considered dead, and the player is waited at a locked door. Finally, there are several areas of the game almost devoid of interactive content and boil down to running down passageways. So, with all of that out of the way, what would a more successful Jet Force Gemini or similar game do differently? First, changing the progression system for the second half of the game is a must. What I think would be the best way to do this would be for the tribal leader, once the first Mizar encounter is completed, to reveal where he thinks spaceship parts are and what needs to be done to access them. In addition to this, each spaceship part needs to be tied to some individual, isolated challenge on each level, instead of just being placed in a random position. These could be enemy strongholds, minigames, boss battles, and several other potential tasks. There should be a sense of accomplishment tied to collecting the parts, outside of just possessing them. Second, collecting so many tribals is simply just too excessive to complete the game. An alternative to this that would be easy to implement would be including some sort of ancient tribal super weapon that requires all of the tribals to be saved to use. Something comparable would be obtaining the Fierce Deity mask to defeat Majora. Third, the game would benefit tremendously from an expanded HUD with a mini-map. Even if the map only showed the current room and didn't reveal secrets, having markers that show points of interest could make hunting down that last tribal on a level a little less frustrating. Fourth, more of the weapons in the game should feel useful. Enemies without shields or armor are best handled with the machine gun, and all of the others with tri-rockets. Perhaps adding enemy variety or more puzzle mechanics could help. Maybe some enemies are weak to fire, others to electricity or something similar. Or doors and obstacles could only be passed using certain tools. The Zelda series is a good source of inspiration for this as well. Lastly, many of the areas and necessary collectibles require a certain character to reach, but this is rarely immediately apparent. Being able to change characters on the fly, once all 3 characters can access the entire map, would prevent any backtracking and players losing interest from having to repeat content. Jet Force Gemini is a solid game that has plenty of memorable moments and engaging gameplay features. If it's something you haven't tried before, it's definitely worth giving a shot. Hopefully, when another game releases that follows the game's strengths in its design, it doesn't also follow its shortcomings.